Hello and welcome everyone to Qatar Foundation's Education City Speaker Series, a global platform that brings us all together to discuss and learn and engage around some of the key issues that shape our world. Today our topic is Palestine, amplifying Palestine's voice, the reality, the resilience, and the right to freedom as Palestinians continue to live under the constant fear, the daily threat of being forcibly expelled from their own homes, the neighborhoods their families have lived in for generations. I'm Rida Fakhri, a broadcast journalist based in Washington, D.C. I host TRT World's political and global affairs programs. I also moderate the Doha debates. It is my pleasure to moderate this discussion today over the next 60 minutes. Now, for those of us who have covered it for many, many years, those of us who've read about it or watched it on our TV screens, it is an all too familiar never-ending cycle. We saw it play out again just last month as Israel's military forces pounded Gaza for 11 seemingly endless days and nights, targeting schools, hospitals, residential buildings, media outlets, water, electricity, and other basic civilian infrastructure. We saw it when Israel's heavily armed police forces attacked peaceful worshippers inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a sacred site for Muslims around the world and an enduring, imposing symbol of Palestinian resistance. We saw it as well when entire families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem were being threatened with the brutal forced expulsions from their homes by Israeli settlers, often under the watchful eye, if not the active protection of Israeli forces. It was Sheikh Jarrah just a few weeks ago, and it still is Sheikh Jarrah. But it is also the Bustan neighborhood of Silwan in occupied East Jerusalem, where at least 13 Palestinian families are facing the arbitrary deadline that Israeli settlers themselves issued to demolish their homes, or else the majority of people living there are children. Now, Palestinians are calling this latest violation of international law an act of ethnic cleansing. So where is the outrage? Where is the international community? Despite the growing solidarity movement that we have seen with Palestinians across many parts of the world, there is still a largely muted global response. A 10-year ceasefire, which was violated just a few days ago, is being tested while the mass arrests of hundreds of Palestinian activists in East Jerusalem continue. Now, today, Palestinians across the occupied West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Gaza, have all joined forces. They are rising up against Israel's illegal settlements, against the military occupation, against these systemic human rights violations and policies of dispossession. But it isn't just Palestinians. Their voices are being echoed by a growing number of people across the world, leading human rights organizations who are using increasingly bold language to describe Israel's oppressive actions and policies. We hear words like settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid, including here in the United States, in Congress, in the mainstream media. So things look like they may be changing, but is that enough to fundamentally change the narrative, the grim reality on the ground for millions of young Palestinians who have shown day in, day out courage to speak up by using the most powerful tool at their disposal, their voice? How do we, journalists and others who seek the truth, do our bit to highlight and amplify these voices who dare to speak up against injustice and oppression? How do we counter the false prevailing narrative, the false moral equivalencies, and yes, too often the false choice of words to describe what is really going on today in Palestine? So is the tide finally beginning to shift? In the next hour, we'll be hearing from four powerful, inspiring voices whose activism and unwavering commitment is helping to uncover the harsh realities of daily life for Palestinians living under occupation, despite the sustained and often relentless pressures they face to remain silent. Joining us from East Jerusalem is activist and musician Mariam Afifi. She's a member of the Palestine Youth Orchestra. Joining us from Ramallah is writer and researcher Mariam Barghouti. From Doha, Jamal Shayal, he is a senior veteran correspondent with Al Jazeera And last but not least, from Sydney, Australia, it's a pleasure to be joined by academic and author Randa Abdul Fattah. So welcome to you all. It's a pleasure to share this platform with you today. But before we begin and before we hear from our panelists, let me just remind everyone that you can watch this discussion on Qatar Foundation's YouTube and Facebook channels. If you're watching it on Microsoft Teams, you can read the subtitles in English, in Arabic, in French, Spanish, and Italian. Now, we of course want to hear from all of you as well. So make sure to unmute yourselves. Send us your questions by posting them in the Q&A section that you'll find in the webinar. I'll be taking as many of them as I can later this hour. So keep them coming, make them good and short if you can. And since this is all about amplifying Palestine's voices, every tweet, every post counts. So let's amplify those voices by using the hashtag ECS Speaker Series and the hashtag unmute yourself. So then, time now to unmute our first speaker, Mariam Afifi. Mariam, when you aren't busy playing the contrabass, as you do with the Palestine Youth Orchestra, you are out there on the streets of occupied East Jerusalem protesting against Israeli violations. A video of you smiling while you were being arrested in Sheikh Jarrah went viral. People watching videos of you and other young Palestinians being literally dragged and beaten by Israeli police have had many deep, visceral reactions to what they see. But not smiles, I don't think. You chose to smile. What was going through your mind at that point? What message were you trying to send?
So, hello, how are you? As you know, for more than 2 months now, 2 months and a half now, we have been protesting in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah against the ethnic cleansing taking place against 28 families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, especially in what is called وحدات حي Sheikh Jarrah. We have been protesting actually for more than 2 months, but on that day, for more than a month now, month and a half now, the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood has been under siege. It has been closed for the Palestinians. So Israeli settlers can enter the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood easily and freely. We Palestinians are not allowed to enter Sheikh Jarrah, and if we enter it through different ways. We find our ways to enter it, but these ways put us under danger of Israeli snipers and under the danger of Israeli settlers who can shoot us or who can throw rocks on us while trying to enter the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. So on that day, we were protesting outside the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Because we were not allowed to enter, when I saw around 6 or 7 Israeli soldiers attacking a girl. So looking at my story of my arresting story, you would understand the story of the cycle that took place that night. So this girl that was attacked by 6 or 7 Israeli soldiers, she was attacked because she was trying to help a woman enter her house that is located inside the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. She was attacked because she wanted to help the woman and her 16-year-old son who was arrested that night. I tried to help her on the first place, but an Israeli soldier attacked me and pushed me away and shouted at me in Hebrew, "Move from here." But I didn't move from here, and it wasn't only me. Like many people were trying to help that girl, trying to raise her up from the ground that was full of skunk water. So this same soldier, he dragged me from my hijab and the tips of my hair and arrested me. I want to say something is that night that place was full of people taking photos and videos of what was going on in Sheikh Jarrah and of the protesters. Imagine all the Palestinians being brutally arrested without any media coverage. Like I was treated that way, even with media coverage. when I was arrested, when I was taken to the investigation center, 8 other Palestinians were arrested as well. None of them was arrested under like media coverage. 3 of them were children. The youngest was 11 years old. His chest was full of bruises, and most of them were arrested by what we call مستعربين. مستعربين are part of the Israeli, like they are Israeli soldiers, but they dress in Palestinian clothes, like they dress in normal clothes in order to be under coverage. And when they are like doing their work, like arresting people or whatever, they won't be seen in Israeli like they won't be seen as Israeli soldiers.
And yet, Mariam,
yeah,
and the smile, yeah, tell us where the smile came from.
So the smile, I was feeling like it was a bit totally ironic, and it was totally bizarre. Like, why would you treat anyone in that kind of brutality? Like, I was trying to help a girl. Like, you saw the brutality that I was dealt with. Why did you choose? Like, I was thinking about like how the soldier is thinking, the mentality of the soldier. Like, why would you treat me in that way? What anger, what hate do you have inside yourself to treat someone else in that way, like a helpless girl without any kind of weapon, like she doesn't hold any weapon, I'm talking about myself, and treat her in that brutal way for just trying to help a girl. And he saw me trying to help a girl, like anyone would do that. And at that moment exactly, I was looking on my right to see the protesters that I was protesting with. When I saw a girl, like when I saw them, I smiled back to them in just to give them support and to say, like, I'm okay, I'm good, don't worry, I'm fine, I'm not afraid, everything will be fine.
And so you were able to display that basic sign of humanity to others, and to show the Israeli soldiers, the oppressors, as you call them, that they weren't going to break your spirit. It was interesting as well, briefly, Mariam, when you confronted a soldier who I believe was sitting in his tank, certainly in a military vehicle, asking him very calmly if he wants to see his kids grow up defending, quote, the wrong side, the oppressors, as you put it. What was his reaction to you, and what is the reaction of other Israelis like him when you confront them with this very simple, basic question?
So he didn't answer back, but I think his silence was a sign of, I would like to think of it as a deep thinking of what I was telling him. Especially, I want to say a fact that many of the Israeli soldiers are volunteers from not like they are not Israelis. They might be volunteers from other countries, from the USA, from Europe, even from Eastern Asian countries. So my question to him was also a question to everyone who comes to volunteer in the Israeli military. Like, why would you leave your country and come volunteer or come work in this military? You know, it's bizarre, and I was really angry. So I think my questions were getting out of this anger. You know, like it's obvious, you know, it's obvious that people are being displaced. Why do you want to be in the wrong side of history and be a tool for a system that displace people and you know?
Yeah, and I think it is interesting to explore this issue more deeply as well with Mariam Barghouti and others, the extent to which Israelis serving in the military forces or not, the younger generation of Israelis are becoming more immune, more radicalized with everything going on around them, more oblivious to the suffering of Palestinians. So to you, Mariam Barghouti, as a writer based in Ramallah, I know that you have long documented those harsh realities that Mariam Afifi just spoke about, of daily life, the subjugation of Palestinians living under military occupation. Your research as well has focused on the plight of Palestinians who have been forced to flee, to seek refuge in neighboring countries. We sometimes forget about them. Now, during this latest crisis, yours was one of these unmuted and unmutable voices, even when your Twitter account was repeatedly suspended, when your voice was being restricted for simply showing the simple truths of the occupation and settlements. You carried on. Now, knowing how closely you and others like you, prominent Palestinian activists and writers, are being monitored, how do you continue to find the courage, the determination to carry on?
It's a really good question. And I think it's one that's been asked quite frequently. How do you find the courage? And it is not about finding the courage as much as it is the urgency of the context kind of pushes you to continue on. Forced to flee is perhaps misleading. It's not a fleeing period. It's a fleeing from these colonial forces that are trying to kill us, that are trying to ethnically cleanse us. And it is this clinging on to life. It is this clinging on to our right to live in freedom and in dignity, not just as human beings, but in our right to do so as Palestinians, that I think continues to push us through. More than this, with the censorship that is happening on social media, it is coming at a time where we are literally being shot down in the streets, where there are settlers, including the army and the Israeli police, chanting death to Arabs. And more than this, there's also now, Palestinian authorities colluding with Israel and politically assassinating Palestinians. It is not a mere finding the courage. It is recognizing the urgency of the situation that we are living under. It is recognizing the point we are at, where we have two choices. We are either going to be ethnically cleansed in silence, or we are going to fight back and afford ourselves the chance at actually living in Palestine as Palestinians.
The chance of living in Palestine as Palestinians, you say, Mariam, but also the chance to just speak up, post, tweet, things that we would all take for granted. In fact, one of your tweets I found interesting, and I want to read just a bit of it here. You say, do not take our tweets, our posts for granted. When Palestinians speak up against Israel's apartheid, we risk our safety. The potential of being arrested or charged with false allegations are high. So you encourage everyone to amplify the voices. You also wrote this. You wrote about a blackout that Palestinians face, not on an individual basis. You say it is about suppressing an entire people, an entire culture. Quote, scrubbing and obscuring the criminal acts by which Israel replaces us with its settlements, burying us in the abyss of history as a population of ghosts. Palestinians are summoned to answer for imagined crimes, while Israelis enjoy impunity for crime they actually commit. You relay so eloquently what every Palestinian, I imagine, feels, but it often comes at a price, doesn't it?
It does come at a price, but at the same time, Palestinians are facing the risk of being shot, of being politically detained, of being displaced from their homes on the daily. The digital violence that we are facing, the complicity of companies that are based mostly in the US, is not something new. If anything, it is reflective of the efforts to silence Palestinians, to place us under this blackout. No oppressing regime, whether it's Israel or the Palestinian authorities, wants to be exposed for its crimes. At every demonstration, at every political action, our social media platforms are either censored or our internet connection is interrupted. And this is because of how important documentation is, of how important evidence is. This is what holds criminals accountable. This is what brings change. And change necessarily means shaking up the status quo. It necessarily means that the people that committed the crimes will be held accountable, and they will be removed from the powers that they have over population. For the tweet that you just read, in regards to everything that we may post publicly is put through as incitement, I just want to bring back the case, the most recent case of Muna al-Kurd and Muhammad al-Kurd, who are not the only Palestinians that were detained over their very vocal voices against Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing. But just to show you the extent that our words seem more dangerous than the practices we are reflecting. And this is what Palestinians are saying. If you are more insulted by the words apartheid and colonialism than you are about the actual practices on the ground, displacing neighborhoods en masse, then there's a problem with your own reflections, not with Palestinian words.
Well, as you say, there is power in words and there's power in numbers. Of course, the more people across the world share evidence and testimonies that is put out there by people like you, Mohammed and Muna al-Kurd, Mariam Afifi, and so many other young Palestinians, the more likely Israel is to be held accountable, despite the pitfalls that you just mentioned about social media and the fact that many social media platforms, let's face it, have tried to suppress Palestinian voices. So they might be accused of trying to do this, to suppress the truth by removing or hiding a lot of the content that exposes the brutality of the Israeli occupation and cast doubt on the narrative that Israel actually puts out there. But social media platforms have as well been used by Palestinians to fight the injustice they face, to find their voice, to use those platforms as a megaphone to spread the word about what is going on. It's also, I believe, helping sensitize a lot of people around the world about the plight of Palestinians, which is often censored in the mainstream Western media. Which brings me to Jamal El-Shayal. Jamal, you are a senior correspondent with Al Jazeera. You've covered the Middle East and North Africa for many years now. I know we were both colleagues back in 2010 at Al Jazeera when you covered the attack by Israeli commandos on an international aid flotilla that was heading for Gaza. Since then, you've been banned from reporting on location, but I know that you followed very closely as a correspondent the situation, the plight of Palestinians from the wider region. As a correspondent as well, who has been covering this from a place and a network that was once again targeted by Israeli airstrikes, is there a sense for you of déjà vu, that we've been here before too many times? Or is it more of the same, with a slight difference? Is there something that you sense that has changed now, a different level of coverage, of solidarity with Palestinians in newsrooms across the world?
I think it's a mixture of both, Rita. Even though that seems a bit contradictory to say, and I'll try and explain, it's obviously what we see to be the same is the same policies of ethnic cleansing, the same policies of trying to censor the truth, the same policies of disregard to free media, and all the other violations that we've seen Israel exercise for decades now. What is different is that, and I prefer to say, rather than there is a change in narrative, there is a correction in narrative. And that's what's more important, because it's all about the premise, particularly when we're talking about the illegal occupation of Palestine. It's so important, not just when we're talking about language used, but to understand context and to go back to where it starts. You know, a lot of journalists, unfortunately, their clock only begins 24 hours ago, a few weeks ago, if we're lucky, maybe a few months ago. But the reality is, and this is why it's so important, is that there was a narrative that started decades ago, which was very clear that there was a land that had people. There was a bunch of people that came from different countries and forcibly removed them. From a journalistic perspective, when I would say this, and I've been working now, since 2003 as a journalist. I remember when I would say this and speak, it would be seen as, oh, that's so brazen, and how can you do this? And no, it comes across as bias and so forth. But the truth is, there is truth, there are facts, and then there is opinion. The facts of the matter is, and this is what we should try and do as journalists, I think there has been, there's no denying that there are, as with every story, there are lobbies, there is pressure to try and report something in a certain way, right? And those have yielded results over those decades, particularly in mainstream Western-centric media outlets that have forced journalists to self-censor themselves to the point where they see what's right as wrong and wrong as right. And I'm going to give a very simple example to show you how there has been slight correction, but at the same time, how we're still in a big issue. There was an interview with Sky News' correspondent, Mark Stone in Jerusalem, during the latest events a month ago. And he was talking about how, he's been reporting for a couple of years, and his great, all respect to him and all my colleagues, but how he had been reporting for years about what's been going on in Jerusalem, and he had never seen how violent the police have been as they have been in this latest episode. And he said that whilst we go as journalists and ask the Israeli police and officials why they've dragged these young men and women and so forth, all they do is they respond and say that there will be an investigation. At which point Mark says, but I can tell you as a reporter who's reported for a couple of years now that when they tell us these investigations happen, nothing comes out of them. Okay, my question now, if that's what you've been witnessing for the past 2 years, why is the world only hearing about it now? Surely, as a journalist, your responsibility is to call that out for the past couple of years. Yes, the floodgates have somewhat been broken now, so it's become a bit popular, maybe a bit more acceptable for people to be a bit more what they would call critical, but actually it's just called factual about reporting it. But there is a huge responsibility on journalists to be able to differentiate bias from truth. And this is where I think we have seen a slight correction and a bit of change as a result of this, as a consequence of this. Obviously, there's so many factors in terms of social media, in terms of live streaming and so forth, but yes.
And I think you're right to say, I mean, it's a mixed picture, but there is certainly some improvement in the way some of the Western media, traditional media, is allowing more room for people to speak up and to humanize Palestinians. I mean, we all saw that front page spread of the New York Times in which you had the 66 pictures of those children with their names, children in Gaza who were killed in the Israeli airstrike, something I don't think we could have seen a few years ago. So there's an increased tendency to want to humanize Palestinians more than they used to be before. There are also those who have lost their jobs, of course. There was a correspondent from AP who lost her job for simply speaking up as well for Palestinians, simply telling the truth on both sides of the equation, not being pro-Palestinian in any way. And I know that there is a correspondent from Haaretz, the liberal Israeli newspaper, who actually walked out and decided to leave his job because he was being censored for showing what the Palestinians were going through. So there is all too often, Jamal, as you say, this still selective, convenient editorial amnesia when it comes to the Palestinian people, and a concerted effort still to couch, I don't want to call it a conflict, to couch this in ways that reflect the Israeli narrative. So we hear a lot of words like both sides, the conflict. The word occupation is so often missing from the narrative. So how do Palestinians, briefly to you, Jamal, how do they counter this misleading depiction of their daily reality? Is social media then, however imperfect it is that the answer?
I think it's a big part of the answer. I don't think there's one single means. There are so many different avenues to do it. We see it through art and culture and music. We see it through social media platforms. We see it through Palestinian journalists who literally have risked their lives to report and who have been killed. Some of them have had their eyes shut out. The list is ridiculous in terms of what they have had to put up with in order simply to represent or to report what is happening in the world. Obviously, we saw the destruction of the Al Jazeera offices in Gaza. Thankfully, none of my colleagues were injured at the time, but it just goes to show, essentially, the message was crystal clear. There's no two ways about it. And, we all heard after it, they were going to release evidence that showed that there was fighters inside and so forth. It's been 2 months, we haven't seen anything, and we won't see anything. Just very quickly on this point, and I think this is where journalists need to ask themselves very simply. So many journalists, when they're studying journalism or they start off their career, they ask themselves,
the daughter of dispossessed Palestinians, to really position myself, the fact that I am speaking as a Palestinian for justice and for liberation on stolen land. And this is the essence of my politics and the way that I fight for liberation, based on the fact that we are in a shared struggle against settler colonialism, and then that I do that from a settler colony. And it helps me understand what I'm up against and why it is that I could be put on a national television program on a panel where I had to face off with the former ambassador to Israel sitting next to me for balance, because of course Palestinians are never afforded the opportunity to speak on their own terms. It is always constructed in terms of having to speak on, on one side, the illusion of neutrality and objectivity, when of course when you are looking at the brutality of Israel's regime, the idea that you cannot have a position, that there is neutrality, is in itself a position. It is a position in favor of the belligerent Israeli state, because to say that, to pretend that this is something that is neutral, that there are two sides, is of course taking a position. And so the fact that I had to sit there and then be asked a question in which I was basically being asked to sympathize with a distressed dog, that showed to me the dehumanization of Palestinians. It was probably on reflection later, and believe me, as Palestinian activists in Australia, we reflected a lot in our WhatsApp groups. How could the ABC have allowed such a question? In the end, we decided it was really an own goal, because as offensive and honestly in that moment, a lot of things went through my mind. The first thing that went through my mind was, how am I going to resist the racist trope of the angry Arab woman? Because believe me, I had to contain my anger. But as Palestinians know, when you are speaking, it is in an orientalized racist context in which your anger, your resistance, your emotions are always weaponized against you. And so I had to maintain that, facade of being the cool, rational, calm, polite person responding to what was essentially the most dehumanizing and offensive question a Palestinian can be given in the context of the massacre of Gazans, most of them children. And then at that point to actually realize that I had an opportunity here to expose what is in essence the logic of the Zionist ideology, which is that Palestinians are not human beings, whether they are children, whether they are adults, whether they are Hamas, or whether they are in the diaspora, Jerusalem, it doesn't matter. The feelings of a distressed dog will trump every single Palestinian's right. And so that was a lot to negotiate in that moment, but I think it crystallized how far we have to go. But it is not a narrative of despair. I don't have the luxury of despair sitting here in Australia when I am, on a panel with amazing people like Miriam and Jamal and Miriam, who are facing off Israeli belligerents every single day. Despair is not an option, but it does show that there is so much work to do in the Western context in terms of breaking down these racist narratives, just simply to be seen as human.
And as a Palestinian who lives across the world, who does her bit in breaking down this narrative, in correcting the record, how organized, how powerful do you find the Palestinian, the wider Arab voice to be? Those living in diaspora who have to face off the very powerful, well-oiled machine that is the pro-Israel Jewish lobby. I know that after the meeting between an Australian Jewish group and ABC executives following that Q&A segment, you tweeted, "Zionist victimhood is warped and dangerous." So how do you counter that? Because there's always that anti-Semitism argument, isn't there, that is being deployed and weaponized constantly to limit any legitimate criticism of Israeli policies. Do you find that that is beginning to change? Are you seeing more pushback from within the Jewish community?
I think that the hysteria and the reflexive, anti-Semitic accusation is actually accelerating, and that's because Palestinian voices and resistance are gaining more traction. And so you often see that racists will increase their intensity of their racism, the intensity of their, attempts to suppress and mute and muzzle your voice, when they see how effective your voice is. And so we are seeing actually a point at which that, the accusation of anti-Semitism basically comes at you whenever you open your mouth. In fact, in critiquing the Q&A program, they actually said that both questions asked to me were biased, and in fact both questions were asked by Zionists. That is how warped the logic is. Basically, there is nothing that a Palestinian can say that will be accepted.
As you say, the complaints were that the questions were skewed. So there's always going to be this pushback, no matter how devoid of realism it may be. Mariam Afifi, back to you as we begin sort of a second round of questions, and as I keep an eye on the questions that the audience is sending to us as well on Microsoft Teams. And please keep those coming. I'll get to them in just a moment. But Mariam, there is no doubt that there is growing solidarity, a solidarity movement even with Palestinians, not just in Australia, but here in the United States and in Europe as well. There's a palpable shift that we've all sensed. For you, though, as a Palestinian living on the ground, is there a sense that something is finally changing, that there is a difference?
Any post about Palestine would be deleted on Instagram or on Facebook. So there's tendency to erase Palestine and to erase the name Palestinian. We, as me as a member in Palestine Youth Orchestra, when we tour in European countries and other countries around the world under the name Palestine Youth Orchestra, we see the surprise in the eyes of those who come to watch us in that, oh, we never knew that there's something called Palestine Youth Orchestra. They think that the name Palestine was only used before 1948. After 1948, there is no entity, there is no organization as under the name Palestine. Any organization or entity under the name Palestine is being attacked. And I will tell you, once 3 years ago with the Palestine Youth Orchestra, 2 years ago, we performed in Amsterdam in one of the most important halls in Europe, which is called the Concertgebouw, and we were attacked by Zionists in Amsterdam who wanted to cancel our show because they believe that our show is anti-Semitic, and Concertgebouw was one of the places that Jews during the Holocaust took refuge. So they believe that our show is anti-Semitic because it's under the name Palestine. So yeah, music does have, and other kinds of arts, literature, writing, they play a role in at least not erasing our identity as Palestinians. There's this tendency to erase our identity. Yeah.
And it's extraordinary how simple words, factual words, as Palestine, historical words to depict an entire people and a place can be suggested to be anti-Semitic in any way, just like the boycott, divest, investment approach and movement as well, which worked so well in stopping apartheid in South Africa, is being very often attacked in many Western capitals as well. And that's testament to the power of the pro-Israel lobby as anti-Semitic. And the list goes on. I do want to come to you, Mariam Barghouti, quickly, if I can, to ask you, as someone who's lived in both Palestine and the United States, who studied in both places, when you hear the word apartheid being used the way it has been over the last few weeks, do you find that there is a taboo that is finally being broken? Are you seeing more people willing to step up and speak?
I think it's not a taboo that's been broken. I think many people that are speaking up now have known this for so long, but just like the United States is its own colonial state and has not has not addressed that in its own merit, that people will necessarily be repressed, because accountability for Israel means accountability for any other crimes that were committed in a similar fashion. But more than this, isn't just the US. Let us speak about, for instance, the normalization that is happening in the Gulf states. More than 25% of social media accounts from the Gulf have been in support of normalization. So it is speaking on that level, because it is the microaggressions that have led and resulted to where we are now. And that is severe and brute violence. So it's not just what is happening now, it is what led up to this. And it's important to look at that as a pattern and a trend of what is happening now that could lead up to even worse violence in the future as well.
Jamal, let me put to you a couple of questions that members of the audience have sent through. Someone writes, Jamal mentioned a correction in narrative. How can we be sure that Israel won't undo all the work and correction, quote unquote, that Palestinians have done, simply because they have the support of powerful countries? And someone else asks something along those lines. How effective are Israeli tactics to silence the media? How can we fight against them?
So I think I'm generally, even though this may not come across in this session, I'm generally a positive person. And I think the default of humans is to be truthful. The default is to want good for other people. So the narrative, in essence, as I say, as it first started, when it first began, even by the way, if you look at BBC archives with all the British responsibility for where we are now, when the BBC was reporting on the Ergun and Haganah and the attacks that were taking place at the King David Hotel and so forth, reported them as terrorist attacks because they were terrorist attacks in the sense that indiscriminate violence attacks and so forth. It was only after pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli lobbies worked so hard, invested so much in changing the narrative, the default narrative of factual accuracy to a certain extent, that it regressed into a bias cover-up for everything that Israel was doing. So how you make sure it's going to succeed is, my belief, is that ultimately justice prevails. And when we look at history, yes, there are unfortunately way too many dark chapters in it, but all of those dark chapters ultimately end with liberation. All of them ultimately end with a resurrection of societies in a way that is better off. Not too far long ago, by the way, when we were talking about apartheid in South Africa, and you were looking at how powerful the countries and the allies of apartheid South Africa, of which obviously Israel, surprise, surprise, was one of them, people would have thought, oh my God, you know, this is not going to happen, it's crazy and so forth. But ultimately, it changed. And I think what's so important here is to be unwavering and unapologetic about the truth. When I was at university, very quickly, I spoke at an event and I spoke about my own personal reading and belief into the situation. I said, occupation pre-1967 is the same as occupation post-1967. It doesn't make sense for you to tell me if I killed somebody at 5 o'clock, that's okay, but if I kill them at 5:05, that's bad. Just illogical, right? And I said that, and people, oh my God, and so forth, and how, and right now, the concept of a one-state solution that includes everybody equal in the eyes of the law is now being normalized when just a few years ago, you were crazy to suggest it. So I think genuinely there is a shift. And I think ultimately the persistence and unapologetic nature of people in an eloquent way and a way that actually shows the truth for what it is the way forward.
Randa, picking up on what Jamal just said and Mariam before him, we talk about correcting the narrative, right? The misleading narrative that is out there and that shapes so much of people's public opinions. The more people know about the issue, the more they are likely to see it for what it is, the more they are likely to see the injustice, the oppression. But looking at education and knowing full well how important what we teach students at school is, and with this whole raging debate going on right now in the US, I believe in Australia as well, about critical race theory, how important is it to set the record straight in these books that children use? How easily done is that in today's climate and amid the realities that we face?
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about, which is the education system. And, you know, when we talk about Edward Said and permission to narrate, it's often used in the context of the denial by media for Palestinian voices. But it's also permission to narrate in the school systems, in education systems, because we have there silenced and redacted histories, Palestinian narratives. The Nakba is not taught. I'm in schools a lot in the context of my books, and also as an academic, you know, talking to schools about racism. And every time I go into schools, I talk to them about the Palestinian narrative. I talk to them about Palestine through my father's history. And almost every single school, every student that I speak to, including Palestinian and Muslim and Arab students, do not understand the history of this of what is happening. They have not been taught this history. And that's why it is so important, because this is the generation that is on social media. This is the generation that actually doesn't have a living memory of apartheid. And so we also have to think about how are we going to get them to understand our narratives, you know, the idea of apartheid as, you know, racial supremacy, something that they can actually understand, is about then talking to them about the history, opening up that history to them, and really unlearning the systems that they are exposed to and offering them alternative histories.
And as a writer, as an author, Randa, I wonder to what extent you believe the problem is in the messaging, in the words that are used. I often hear you use the word settler colonialism. Yet, when we talk about this whole issue, the word settlement is used. Would it be more powerful to use the word colonies rather than settlements, for example? Does the choice of words matter? And when you look at the solution ahead, you said it was a very simple solution. Let's have a one-state solution. Democracy for everyone, equal rights. Can you address both these issues briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. Language is critical. You know, instead of settlements, annexation. I mean, the language is used as a shield, either to support Israeli annexation plans, Israeli facts on the ground, and so, you know, peace process. All these words that are used to really, you know, invisibilize the injustices. And so, absolutely, most of our work, particularly in the context of a Western country that is so closely allied with Israel, is about challenging the language that is used and demanding that our resistance is expressed on our own terms, and that if you are going to be an ally, if you're going to support us, that you use the terms that we feel are sufficient for our cause. And so it's even about getting allies to come on board with this idea that this is a settler colony, this is about apartheid, this is about annexation, it is about occupation. And so it's about getting them to respect the fact that we will fight this on our own terms and with our own language, and you will embrace that language if you are to be a genuine ally.
Mariam Barghouti, to you, as a member of a family that has long symbolized this struggle, like so many other Palestinian families as well, do you see a unifying figure who can bring Palestinians together today around one unifying message? Because all too often, the chaos that reigns among Palestinian factions and Palestinian groups, the lack of unity, doesn't quite help the cause of the Palestinian people themselves, the young generation who want a way out, who want less corruption, less infighting, who really want to get on with things and fight the occupation in such a way that their lives would change once and for all.
So this is one of the problems that I had, is that we're constantly looking for one figure, but for us, the unity is there, the message is there. Palestinians want freedom and liberation and to live in dignity. And representatives are just that, they're representatives. And when they start failing to actually represent the demands, to represent the Palestinian call for freedom, for justice, for holding criminals accountable and refusing their control over our lives, that is the unity you are looking for. Palestinians will be necessarily attacked every single time they want to be unified. Israel's divide and conquer, Palestinian factionalism, all of it revolves around the fragmentation of Palestinians. What unifies us is this specific call for freedom and dignity. Let that be the guide, not necessarily one person. People come and go, regimes come and go. The right to live in dignity stays.
And it seems that a lot of young Palestinians have decided that they will take things into their own hands. They've united in Palestine and beyond. So, Mariam, to you, this question from a member of the audience who asks, what is the role of youth outside Palestine in amplifying the Palestinian resistance? What ways would you recommend youth in international universities, can advocate for Palestinian freedom, and how effective do you think it would be?
I think the frequency of the repression that students are facing, especially students in universities and in schools, in calling out Israeli apartheid, is very telling of just how valuable our voices are. And more than just advocating, it's important that youth stick together, that they create this community, that if a student is kicked out of university for saying Israel's an apartheid state, to stick with them and call out that repression. More than advocating for Palestinians, it is advocating for their own rights to not be complicit in apartheid. The attack on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is essentially forcing and coercing populations to be complicit. And the refusal of that together and collectively, I think, is an important role communities, especially internationally, can play. Creating your own safe spaces will extend to Palestine.
And Jamal, how important is the wider Arab region for this Palestinian struggle? Because here we are talking about a lot of the galvanization that we've seen with people across many different, mostly Western capitals. But in the Arab world, there seems to be a certain apathy, despite this renewed commitment and solidarity that many, many people across the world are showing to the Palestinians. To what extent do you feel, covering the Middle East the way you do, speaking to a lot of the Arab officials, to what extent do you feel that this struggle of the Palestinian people has been undermined by the policies that some Arab governments have pursued in normalizing relations with Israel at a time when the conditions for peace may not have been met?
Well, when you speak to people on the streets, and I remember vividly, my first, one of my first big stories was covering the Arab uprisings in 2011. I was in Egypt, Tahrir Square, in Suez, Alexandria. We then moved on to Libya, Syria, and other countries. And in all those protests, you would always see in the center squares the flags of that country, and you would always see Palestinian flags as well. The reality is that the Arab provinces are, to a certain extent, not the same, but under occupation as the Palestinians. Those who govern them are installed by colonialist powers who, there's this concept of post-colonialism. Now, if I just shift very quickly from a journalistic perspective to a bit of my claimed academic kind of thing, is this idea that something called post-colonialism exists, to me, is a fallacy, right? Colonialism never ended. All that happened was it just changed its dress code from boots on the ground to puppets in palaces. And the Arabs understand this. The Arab street understands this. In Suez, for example, the first time they saw the police coming out on January 26th, 27th, and beating people and killing people in the streets during the protests there, the chants were askar, 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 le, huwa ihna sahayna wala eh, right? So they were saying, why are you sending troops against us? Are we Zionists or what, right? This was something that came innately from them. When you look at one of the most unpopular policies of the Mubarak regime was the selling of gas to Israel. When you look at what happened in Jordan now, obviously there was other context to it, but the mass movements of people towards the borders and so forth. So one of the most interesting facts of this latest episode in the ongoing illegal occupation is what it actually showed was, despite those normalizations, despite the attempts to maybe make the Arab population disinterested and to unmarry them from the quest of liberation of Palestine, actually, the majority of them still very much view the Palestinian cause as a central one to them. And in fact, it's by the own admission of the autocratic regimes there. The fact that Egypt's Sisi now is playing more of a role and trying to mediate isn't because he suddenly wants to help the Palestinian people. I mean, they've been besieging Gaza for years. It's because he has seen in that an opportunity to make himself more popular and therefore wants to come. What we saw in Jordan with the conflict there and the crisis with the king and the king's brother, the fact that they allowed for people to march was also an attempt to kind of reduce the pressure on them. So I think when we look at the Arab world, yes, there is many setbacks that exist because of normalization from the United Arab Emirates, from Bahrain, what Saudi Arabia will probably follow through when you look at Sudan, Morocco, and so forth. But when you look at all of these countries, you will also see that they are either directly the antithesis of a liberation movement, so for example in Morocco and so forth, or directly supported and installed by those who support unwaveringly supports the policies that Israel continues to pursue.
Obviously, so many fascinating aspects to this discussion, a discussion that obviously requires much more time than we have today. So in the last few minutes that we have, and I know we've gone over just, well, not yet, but we will go over by a couple of minutes, but I hope you all stay with us for those final comments that I'd love to get as we conclude this edition of the Education City Speaker Series from each one of our panelists. So to you, Mariam Afifi, first, if there was just one thing that we could all do to amplify Palestinian voices, what would it be?
So keep talking about Palestine, keep posting about Palestine. If especially like if social media, if talking about Palestine wasn't that powerful, they wouldn't try to silence us. So now we are, everyone may know about what's happening in Silwan. If you know, Silwan is a big neighborhood in Jerusalem. More than 25,000 Palestinians in Silwan are in danger of being displaced, and I'm talking about the longer, like in the future, more around 25,000 Palestinians in Silwan are in face of displacement. And what's happening in Silwan, what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is the fate of every Palestinian in Jerusalem, in area C and B in the West Bank, because they want Palestinians to be condensed in ghetto-like cities in what they call area A in the West Bank. So this the Nakba has been ongoing since 1948 until today. There is no end to it unless there is end to the colonialism and to the occupation. So keep talking about Palestine, the cause of Sheikh Jarrah and the cause of Silwan and other places like Masafer Yatta, Beta, other places has not finished yet. So that's my
Thank you, Mariam Afifi. And as you say, it's a hugely dangerous and consequential time for all of these Palestinian neighborhoods and villages in and around occupied East Jerusalem. Mariam Barghouti, how do Palestinians and those who believe in basic human rights, in justice and dignity for everyone, how do they join forces with Palestinians to make a difference?
It's calling out oppression, no matter what shape or form it comes in, no matter what uniform it is worn in. It is challenging your own self and holding your own self accountable, and then holding your own community accountable for its own complicity in all crimes, and being brave. Sometimes you will have to be that one voice, but it's so important to still do it anyway.
Important to do it anyway. Mariam Barghouti, thank you. And we so often preach to the converted, don't we, Jamal Shayal? Many within the Jewish community are now speaking up much more forcefully against attempts to intimidate them. What more can and what more should people across the Middle East do to help spread the message?
I think it's, as everybody's been saying, it's important to continue speaking. And when I talk to fellow journalists as well, I think there has been, you'll find people on either spectrum, either those who are very keen on reporting on this story, or those who don't want to touch it at all in fear of being pigeonholed in some way or sidelined. The truth is that when you decide to be a journalist, you've decided to pursue a career that center to it is to represent the truth. The truth should not make anybody feel uncomfortable unless they are a criminal. And therefore, if you are confident and comfortable about yourself, there shouldn't be any question as to how you report something. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be bullied by pressure groups. We shouldn't allow ourselves to second guess and self-censor ourselves just because that's how it's said. We should look at something factually and accurately and say it regardless of it. And I think that is so important, especially today, because even beyond Palestine, when you look at the crackdown on free press in the region, and even globally, actually, it has really gone to levels that maybe people never expected. And that's when you have to fight back to safeguard what is one of the most basic tenets of a free society.
Thank you, Jamal, and to you finally, Randa, as someone who isn't easily intimidated, censored, or bullied, what is your message to younger Palestinians and younger people of conscience around the world who want to lend their voices to this struggle? What is your message to them? How do they make a difference? And how do you seize on this momentum that now seems to exist to galvanize more people into action, especially the young?
The most liberating thing that you can do is to support and embrace the liberation of Palestinians through the idea that this is a global struggle, that these struggles are shared and connected, and that freedom for some people, if it is at the expense of others, is not freedom worth championing. It has to be something that we do that embraces freedom for everybody, and that I think that the most liberating thing that Palestinians can do around the world is to share in other people's struggles and understand that this is something that is beyond the borders of Palestine, and that is the one thing that Zionists are most scared of, the power of unifying our voices against oppression and injustice everywhere.
On this positive, liberating note, thank you to all of our panelists for this fascinating discussion. I hope you found it as inspiring as I have. Let me thank Maryam Afifi, Mariam Barghouti, Jamal al-Shayal, and Randa Abdel Fattah for having been with us in the middle of her night as well in Australia. Thank you to all of you who've joined us for this inspiring discussion that must continue. Thank you to the Qatar Foundation for bringing us together and helping us do what we can to amplify the voices of Palestine. Thanks to all of you for joining us from Qatar and around the world. If you missed some of this discussion, you can watch it again in its entirety on Qatar Foundation's YouTube channel. You can find out more as well about future edition of the Education City Speaker Series by going to qf.org/ECSS. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the Qatar Foundation team, thank you so much for joining us. See you again soon.